The rifle barrel pressed cold against Zelda Zimmerman's spine as she stood in the dusty parlor of her father's house, watching the cruel smile spread across Clayton Thornhill's weathered face. It was May of 1876 in Socorro, New Mexico Territory, and her father had just sealed her fate with a handshake and a pouch of silver coins that clinked like chains being forged around her future. "The wedding's in 3 weeks, girl," Clayton said, his voice thick with satisfaction as he looked her up and down like she was a mare he'd purchased at auction. "You best start getting used to the idea of being Mrs. Thornhill." Zelda's fingernails dug into her palms so hard she felt skin break, but she kept her face carefully blank. At 21 years old, she'd learned to hide her true feelings behind a mask of compliance, at least when it came to surviving in her father's house. Harold Zimmerman had never been a gentle man, not since her mother died of fever when Zelda was barely 10, and in the years since he'd grown harder, meaner, and more desperate as his mining claims dried up and his debts mounted. Clayton Thornhill was the solution to those debts. He owned the largest ranch in the territory, thousands of acres of scrubland and cattle, built on the broken backs of the men who worked for him. Zelda had heard the stories in town, whispered by women with frightened eyes. Clayton's first wife had died under mysterious circumstances. The second had run away in the night, though some said she'd been found weeks later in a ravine, her neck broken. No charges were ever filed. Men like Clayton Thornhill didn't face justice in territories where money and land meant power. "Answer Mr. Thornhill," her father snapped, and Zelda flinched despite herself. "Yes, sir," she managed, the words tasting like ash on her tongue. 3 weeks." Clayton stepped closer, and she could smell whiskey and tobacco on his breath. He was 50 if he was a day, with cruel eyes set deep in a face that might have been handsome once, but had been twisted by years of cruelty into something ugly. His hand reached out and grabbed her chin, tilting her face up roughly. "You'll give me strong sons," he said, not a request but a statement of fact. "And you'll learn to keep a quiet tongue in your head. I don't tolerate sass from women." Zelda's stomach turned, but she forced herself not to pull away. He released her finally, and she heard him and her father talking about the wedding arrangements, about the transfer of property that would clear Harold's debts and leave him with enough money to drink himself to death in relative comfort. She was nothing but a transaction, a piece of property changing hands. That night, Zelda lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to her father's snores rumbling through the thin walls. She had 3 weeks. 21 days to find a way out of this nightmare, or she'd be trapped forever on Clayton Thornhill's ranch, likely dead within a year or two like his previous wives. She'd heard whispers of women who'd escaped bad situations, who'd fled west or north, who disappeared into the wilderness and made new lives for themselves. But Zelda had no money, no horse, nowhere to go. Socorro sat in a valley surrounded by mountains and desert, and a woman traveling alone wouldn't make it 10 miles before dying of thirst or worse. Still, as the days crawled by and the wedding drew closer, desperation began to override fear. Zelda started stealing small amounts of food from the pantry, hiding hardtack and dried meat in a cloth bag she kept under her bed. She took an old canteen and filled it with water each night, pouring it back in the morning before her father woke. She was planning something, though she didn't quite know what yet. Some wild, impossible escape that would probably end with her bones bleaching in the desert sun. 2 weeks before the wedding, Clayton came to the house again. This time he brought his foreman, a snake of a man named Gage who looked at Zelda like she was already his boss's property. They discussed wedding details while Zelda served them coffee with shaking hands, spilling some on the table and earning herself a backhand from her father that split her lip. "You'll need to teach her better manners," Harold said apologetically to Clayton, dabbing at the spilled coffee with a rag. "I'll teach her plenty," Clayton replied, and the way he said it made Zelda's blood run cold. After they left, Zelda stood at the kitchen window and watched the sun sink toward the San Mateo Mountains to the west. The mountains looked purple and gold in the fading light, impossibly far away and impossibly beautiful. Freedom lay somewhere beyond those peaks, if she could just reach them. The next day was Sunday, and her father dragged her to church as he always did, more to keep up appearances than from any actual faith. Zelda sat in the hard wooden pew and barely heard the sermon, her mind racing through impossible plans. After the service, as people milled around outside exchanging pleasantries and gossip, she found herself standing near a group of women discussing a mountain man who'd come into town for supplies. "Big fellow must be 6.5 feet tall," one woman was saying, fanning herself despite the morning chill. "Shoulders like an ox. They say he lives up in the mountains trapping and hunting, comes down maybe twice a year. I heard he's a decent man, though," another woman added. "Helped the Johnsons last winter when their roof collapsed in that storm. Didn't ask for nothing in return. Still, living up there all alone like that, it ain't natural," the first woman replied. Zelda's ears had perked up at the mention of the mountains. A man who lived in the wilderness, who knew how to survive in that harsh country. Before she could think better of it, she turned to the women. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "This mountain man, is he still in town?" The women looked at her with surprise and something like pity. Everyone in Socorro knew about her upcoming marriage to Clayton Thornhill by now. "Last I saw, he was loading supplies at the general store," one of them said gently. "But honey, you shouldn't be talking to strange men, especially not with your wedding so close." Zelda nodded and moved away before they could say more, her heart pounding. An idea was forming, desperate and wild, but it was the only chance she had. If this mountain man was as decent as the women said, if he knew the wilderness well enough to survive up there alone, maybe he could help her. Maybe he could guide her away from Socorro, away from Clayton Thornhill and her father and this life that was crushing her slowly to death. She found her father deep in conversation with some of his drinking companions and slipped away without him noticing. Her feet carried her quickly down the dusty main street toward the general store, her Sunday dress swirling around her ankles. She knew she was taking a risk, that if anyone saw her approaching a strange man, they'd tell her father or worse, tell Clayton. But desperation made her bold. The mountain man was impossible to miss. He stood a full head taller than anyone else on the street, with broad shoulders straining against a buckskin shirt and arms thick with muscle visible even through the leather. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He was loading sacks of flour and other supplies onto a pack mule with an ease that suggested the heavy bags weighed nothing to him. Zelda approached slowly, her mouth suddenly dry. Up close, she could see that despite his rough appearance, his movements were careful and controlled, almost gentle as he arranged the supplies so they wouldn't chafe the mule. His hands were huge, scarred and calloused from hard work, and there was a rifle slung across his back that looked well-maintained and well-used. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned, and she found herself looking up into the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen. They were the color of the sky at dawn, clear and direct, set in a tanned face that was younger than she'd expected. He couldn't be more than 30, she thought, though the weathering of outdoor life made it hard to tell. "Madam," he said, his voice a low rumble. He touched the brim of his hat politely. Zelda glanced around nervously, making sure no one was watching. I need to speak with you, please. It's urgent. Something in her tone, or perhaps the desperation in her eyes, made him pause. He studied her face for a long moment, and she wondered what he saw. The split lip from her father's blow was still visible, and she knew there were shadows under her eyes from sleepless nights. "You in some kind of trouble, madam?" he asked quietly. Tears sprang to her eyes before she could stop them. "More than I can say here on the street. Is there somewhere we could talk? Just for a moment?" He hesitated, clearly weighing the wisdom of getting involved with whatever trouble she represented. Then he nodded toward the alley beside the general store. "Back there. But I can't stay long. I need to be heading back up the mountain before dark." Zelda followed him into the shadowed alley, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was insane. She was about to ask a complete stranger to help her escape, to guide her into the wilderness, to save her from a fate she couldn't save herself from. He'd probably refuse. He'd probably think she was mad. But when she turned to face him in the privacy of the alley, the words came tumbling out before she could stop them. "My name is Zelda Zimmerman. In 2 weeks, my father is forcing me to marry Clayton Thornhill. Do you know that name?" The mountain man's jaw tightened. "I know it. He's a hard man." "He's a murderer," Zelda said bluntly. "He killed his first wife and maybe his second too, and I'll be next. My father sold me to clear his debts, and I have nowhere to go and no one to help me." She took a shaking breath. "I heard you live in the mountains. I heard you know the wilderness. I'm asking you, begging you to take me with you when you leave. Guide me away from here. I'll work. I'll do whatever you need. I'll find my way to another town and make a life somehow, but I cannot marry Clayton Thornhill. I won't survive it." The mountain man stared at her, his expression unreadable behind the beard. The silence stretched so long that Zelda felt fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please," she whispered. "I don't have anyone else to ask." "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Your given name." "Zelda." "I'm Boone Everett," he said. "And what you're asking, it's not simple. Your father will come after you. Thornhill definitely will. They'll call it kidnapping, say I stole you away. Could be a hanging offense." "I know," Zelda said. "I know what I'm asking. But I'd rather die trying to escape than live as Clayton Thornhill's wife." Boone was quiet for another long moment, and Zelda could see the calculation happening behind those blue eyes. He was weighing her words, weighing the risk, deciding whether she was worth the trouble. She held her breath. "I leave at dawn tomorrow," he said finally. "From the north end of town past the last house. If you're there, I'll take you into the mountains. But you need to understand something, Zelda. The life up there is hard. Cold in winter, hot in summer, and always isolated. I live in a cabin 2 days' ride from here, and I don't come down except for supplies. If you come with me, you'll be leaving everything behind. Your father, this town, any life you thought you'd have. You sure that's what you want?" "I'm sure," Zelda said without hesitation. "I'll be there at dawn." Boone nodded once, then turned to leave the alley. He paused at the entrance and looked back at her. "Bring warm clothes and good boots if you have them. And Zelda, don't tell anyone. Not a soul. If word gets out before we're gone, we'll both pay for it." Then he was gone, walking back to finish loading his supplies as if the conversation had never happened. Zelda stood in the alley for a moment, her whole body shaking with a mixture of terror and hope. She'd done it. She'd found a way out. Now all she had to do was make it to dawn without her nerve failing or her father discovering what she'd planned. The rest of Sunday passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Zelda cooked her father's supper, washed the dishes, and sat quietly doing mending work while he drank whiskey and complained about his various grievances. She went to bed at her usual time, lying still in the darkness and listening to the house settle into silence. When she was certain her father was asleep, She rose and began to pack by moonlight. She had precious few possessions. A change of clothes, her warmest shawl, the good boots her mother had bought her years ago that were still sturdy despite their age. The bag of food she'd been hoarding. The canteen. A small knife she used for kitchen work. She rolled everything into a tight bundle and hid it under her bed, then lay back down in her nightgown and waited for morning. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house made her jump, certain her father had somehow discovered her plan. She watched the window, tracking the slow movement of stars across the sky, willing the dawn to come faster. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Finally, the sky began to lighten from black to gray. Zelda rose and dressed quickly in her most practical dress and the warm boots. She tied her hair back simply and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. Taking one last look around the room that had been her prison for so many years, she picked up her bundle and crept toward the door. The house was silent. Her father's snores still rumbled from his bedroom. Zelda eased the front door open inch by careful inch, wincing at every tiny sound. The cool morning air hit her face, and she stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the pre-dawn stillness. Then she was walking, quickly but not running, through the empty streets of Sakura toward the north end of town. Dogs barked in yards as she passed, but no lights came on in windows, no doors opened. The town slept on, unaware that Zelda Zimmerman was walking out of her old life and toward an uncertain future. She found Boone waiting where he'd said, sitting astride a huge gray horse with the pack mule tied behind. In the growing light, he looked even larger than she remembered, a solid presence in the wilderness of her fear. When he saw her approaching, something that might have been relief crossed his face. "You came," he said. "I said I would." Boone dismounted and checked her bundle, repacking it more efficiently onto the mule. Then he turned to her. "You ever ridden before?" "A little, when I was younger." "You'll ride with me then. Easier than teaching you to handle a horse right now, and we need to move fast. Once your father wakes and finds you gone, they'll come looking." He lifted her up onto the horse with an ease that took her breath away, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Then he swung up behind her, and suddenly she was enclosed in his presence, his arms on either side of her as he took up the reins, his chest solid against her back. It should have frightened her, being this close to a man she barely knew, but instead she felt safer than she had in years. "Hold on," Boone said, and urged the horse forward. They moved through the quiet streets and out of Sakura as the sun crested the eastern horizon, painting the mountains ahead in shades of gold and rose. Zelda didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing, only the life she was leaving and the man she'd escaped. Ahead lay the unknown, and the mountains, and the man whose heartbeat she could feel through the buckskin of his shirt. They rode hard for the first few hours, following trails that Boone clearly knew well but that were invisible to Zelda's eyes. The landscape changed gradually from the valley scrubland to rolling hills dotted with pinon and juniper, then began to climb into the foothills of the San Mateo Mountains. The air grew cooler and thinner, scented with pine. Boone didn't speak much as they rode, focused on covering distance and watching their back trail. Zelda was grateful for the silence. Her mind was whirling with the magnitude of what she'd done, the life she'd abandoned, the uncertain future stretching ahead. She'd burned her bridges so completely there could be no going back even if she wanted to. Around midday, Boone finally slowed the horse and guided them off the trail to a small stream hidden among pines. He dismounted and lifted Zelda down, and her legs nearly buckled after hours in the saddle. He steadied her with a hand on her arm. "We'll rest here for a bit." Let the animals drink and have something to eat. He was already moving to care for the horse and mule, loosening cinches and leading them to water with practiced efficiency. Zelda sank down onto a fallen log, her body aching from the unfamiliar exercise of riding. She watched Boone work, noting how gentle he was with the animals, murmuring to them in a low voice as he checked their hooves and rubbed them down. For a man so large and capable of such obvious strength, his movements held a careful tenderness. He brought her some dried meat and hardtack from his supplies, along with a canteen of fresh stream water. It's not fancy, but it'll keep you going. Thank you. Zelda ate slowly, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. Fear and nerves had kept her from eating much over the past days. Mr. Everett, I realize I never asked what I owe you for this. I don't have any money, but I can work. I can cook and clean and Boone, he interrupted. Just Boone. And you don't owe me anything except to survive the journey and build whatever new life you're chasing. He sat down on a rock across from her, his long legs stretched out. I've seen too many people crushed under the boots of powerful men who think money gives them the right to own other folks. If I can help you get free, that's payment enough. Zelda felt her throat tighten with emotion. Why do you live up in the mountains alone, Boone? He was quiet for a moment, staring at the stream. Lot of reasons. The quiet suits me. People can be cruel and complicated, and the wilderness is honest. You know where you stand with a mountain or a winter storm. It won't lie to you or cheat you or use you. He glanced at her. I came west after the war, saw enough of civilization and what men do to each other in the name of causes and country. Decided I'd rather build something simple and clean away from all that. The war, Zelda repeated. The Civil War. That ended 11 years ago. I was young when I enlisted, barely 17 and full of fire about preserving the Union and doing the right thing. Came out the other side at 20 wondering what it had all been for. He shook his head. But that's old history. Point is, I understand wanting to escape something. We've all got our reasons for the choices we make. They rested for another hour, then Boone announced it was time to move again. They climbed back onto the horse and continued their journey into the mountains, following trails that grew narrower and steeper. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh way, all stone and sky and endless stretches of pine forest. Zelda had never been this far from Sakura, and despite her exhaustion and fear, she felt a strange exhilaration. She was free. Whatever came next, she was no longer trapped. As afternoon faded toward evening, Boone guided them to a small clearing beside a creek. We'll camp here tonight. Can't risk a fire that might be seen, so it'll be a cold camp, but we'll have water at least. He helped her down and immediately began making camp with an efficiency that spoke of years of practice. He unsaddled the horse and unpacked the mule, setting up a small camp with bedrolls and supplies arranged in a neat order. Zelda tried to help but mostly got in the way, unused to the routines of wilderness living. Here, Boone said, handing her a bedroll. You'll sleep there by that tree. I'll be on the other side of the fire pit. Not that we're having a fire tonight, but you understand what I mean. You're safe with me, Zelda. I won't touch you or bother you. You have my word on that. Zelda felt something tight in her chest ease slightly. She hadn't realized how much she'd been worrying about that until he addressed it directly. Thank you. They ate a cold supper of dried meat and biscuits from Boone's supplies, washed down with Cold Creek water. The temperature was dropping rapidly now that the sun had set, and Zelda wrapped her shawl tighter around herself. She wasn't used to the mountain cold. Boone noticed her shivering and wordlessly dug through his pack, producing a thick wool blanket that he handed to her. Here. It's going to get colder before morning. These mountains don't care much about human comfort. Won't you need it? I've got what I need. You take it. Zelda wrapped herself in the blanket, grateful for its warmth. She sat for a while, looking up at the stars that seemed impossibly bright and numerous out here away from town. Boone sat nearby, his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness with the alertness of a man who'd spent years living where danger could come from any direction. "Do you think they'll follow us?" Zelda asked quietly. "Your father will search, but he's not a tracker and he doesn't know these mountains. Clayton Thornhill, though, he's a different matter. He's got men who know this country, and he's got the money to motivate them. We need to get you deep enough into the wilderness that they can't easily follow, and then we need to wait them out. How long will that take to get to my cabin? Another day and a half of hard riding, to wait them out. Could be a week or two before they give up the search. Depends on how stubborn Thornhill is." Boone looked at her in the starlight. "You should try to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be another long day." Zelda nodded and lay down on her bedroll, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The ground was hard beneath her, so different from her bed at home, but exhaustion dragged at her like a physical weight. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about what her father's face must have looked like when he found her room empty, or about the rage that Clayton Thornhill must be feeling right now. She must have slept eventually, because she woke to Boone gently shaking her shoulder. The sky was just beginning to lighten, and everything was covered in a thin layer of frost that glittered in the pre-dawn light. "Time to move," Boone said quietly. "Have some water and a bite to eat, then we ride." They broke camp quickly, and Zelda found herself back on the horse with Boone behind her as the sun rose over the mountains. Her body ached from yesterday's ride, but she gritted her teeth and said nothing. This was the price of freedom, and she'd pay it gladly. The day passed in a blur of riding through increasingly rugged terrain. They climbed higher into the mountains, following trails so faint Zelda couldn't tell them from the surrounding forest floor. Boone seemed to navigate by instinct, never hesitating at crossroads or confusing landmarks. This was his territory, and he moved through it with the confidence of a man who knew every tree and stone. By afternoon, the trail became so steep and narrow that Boone had to dismount and lead the horse while Zelda rode alone. Her fingers cramped from gripping the saddle horn, and several times loose stones shifted under the horse's hooves, sending small avalanches rattling down the mountainside. Her heart hammered in her throat during those moments, but Boone's calm voice always guided them through. "Easy now, just lean forward a bit. Good girl, you're doing fine." She wasn't sure if he was talking to her or the horse, but it helped either way. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they crested a ridge and Boone pointed ahead. "There, that's home." Zelda looked where he indicated and saw a valley nestled between mountain peaks, thick with pine forest and bisected by a clear stream that caught the golden afternoon light. At the edge of the stream sat a cabin, solidly built from logs and stone, with smoke drifting from a stone chimney. Even from this distance, she could see it was well made and well maintained, a testament to Boone's skill and care. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. They descended into the valley as dusk gathered, and by the time they reached the cabin, the first stars were appearing overhead. Boone helped Zelda down from the horse, and this time her legs gave out completely. He caught her before she fell, lifting her easily and carrying her to the cabin door. "Sorry," she managed. "I just need a moment. Nothing to apologize for." "You did well for someone not used to that kind of riding." He set her down carefully once he'd gotten the door open and guided her to a chair near the cold hearth. "Let me get a fire going and tend the animals, then I'll make us some proper food." Zelda sat in the chair and looked around the cabin as Boone efficiently built up a fire in the hearth. The interior was simple but well organized, with a sleeping area in one corner, a cooking area with a good iron stove, shelves lined with supplies and tools, and a table with 2 chairs. Everything was clean and orderly, surprising for a bachelor living alone in the wilderness. Furs and hides hung on one wall, and there were books stacked on a small shelf near the bed, more books than she would have expected a mountain man to own. The fire caught and began to warm the space, driving back the mountain chill. Boone went back outside to care for the horse and mule, and Zelda could hear him moving around, his low voice murmuring to the animals as he settled them for the night in what must be a small stable or lean-to behind the cabin. When he came back inside, his arms were full of firewood that he stacked neatly beside the hearth. Then he moved to the cooking area and began preparing a meal with the same efficiency he applied to everything else. Soon the cabin was filled with the smell of salt pork frying and beans cooking, and Zelda's stomach growled audibly. Boone glanced over at her and almost smiled. Won't be long now. They ate at the small table, and Zelda discovered she was ravenous. The hot food after 2 days of cold trail rations tasted like the finest meal she'd ever had. Boone ate silently, but she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What will happen now?" she asked finally. "With me being here, I mean." Boone set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "We wait a week or 2, let the search die down. Then I'll guide you north or west, whichever direction you want to go. There are towns in Colorado where you could make a new start, get work as a seamstress or a cook maybe. Or we could head west toward California, your choice. And in the meantime, you'll stay here. The cabin's not big, but we'll work out sleeping arrangements. I can sleep in the stable with the animals, give you privacy." "That's not fair," Zelda protested. "This is your home, I'm the intruder." "You're not an intruder. You're someone who needed help and I chose to give it." Boone's blue eyes were steady on hers. "We'll figure it out." That first night in the cabin, Zelda slept in Boone's bed while he took blankets and made himself a pallet near the hearth. She protested, but he was immovable on the subject. The bed was more comfortable than anything she'd slept on in years, built with a good mattress stuffed with pine needles and covered with warm furs. She fell asleep almost instantly, too exhausted to do more than send up a prayer of thanks that she'd made it this far. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Boone rose before dawn each day to do chores around the property, checking trap lines he'd set, hunting for fresh meat, chopping wood, tending to the animals and the small garden plot behind the cabin where he grew vegetables during the short mountain summer. Zelda, feeling useless and determined to earn her keep, took over the cooking and cleaning and mending tasks that Boone had been managing on his own. At first, they moved around each other carefully, like strangers dancing around invisible boundaries. But gradually, as the days passed, they began to relax into a comfortable coexistence. Zelda discovered that Boone was surprisingly well-read, and in the evenings after supper, they would sit by the fire and he would read aloud from his collection of books, everything from Shakespeare to scientific treatises to adventure novels. His voice was good for reading, deep and measured, and Zelda found herself looking forward to those evening hours more than anything else. "Where did you get all these books?" she asked one evening about a week into her stay. "Collected them over the years. Traders passing through sometimes have them, and I always had a weakness for the written word. My mother was a teacher before she married. She made sure I could read and write before I was old enough to really appreciate what a gift that was." Boone closed the book he'd been reading and looked at the fire. "She died the year before I went off to war. Fever took her, same as it takes so many." "I'm sorry. My mother died of fever too." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, united by shared loss. Then Boone spoke again. "Can I ask you something, Zelda? What were you planning to do if I hadn't agreed to help you? You would have tried to leave on your own, wouldn't you?" "Yes," she admitted. "I would have taken my chances in the desert. Probably would have died within a day or two, but at least it would have been my choice. At least I wouldn't have died at Clayton Thornhill's hands after years of whatever cruelty he had planned." Boone's jaw tightened. It shouldn't be that way. Women shouldn't have to choose between death in the desert and death at the hands of a brutal husband. But it is that way. The law doesn't protect us. A man can do almost anything to his wife, and it's considered his right. Zelda stared at the flames. "My father hit me my whole life, and no one ever stopped him because a man has the right to discipline his household. Clayton would have been 10 times worse, and everyone in Sakura knew it, but they all looked away because he has money and power. I left civilization partly because I got tired of looking at injustice and doing nothing about it," Boone said quietly. "At least up here, I don't have to watch it happen and pretend it's right." The conversation drifted to other topics, but Zelda found herself thinking about Boone's words long after they'd said goodnight and settled into their respective sleeping spaces. He was a good man, she realized. Genuinely good, in a way that was rare in her experience. He'd risked everything to help her, asked nothing in return, and treated her with a respect and kindness she'd never known from any man. It was dangerous, she knew, to let herself feel gratitude that might shade into something deeper. Boone had been clear from the start that he was helping her escape, nothing more. When the time came, he'd guide her to a new town and a new life, and then he'd return to his mountain cabin and his solitary existence. She was a temporary guest, a problem to be solved, not a permanent part of his world. But knowing that didn't stop her heart from beating faster when he smiled at her, or from noticing the way his muscles moved under his shirt when he chopped wood, or from feeling safe and warm when his voice rumbled through the evening reading. She was falling for him, slowly and surely as a tree falling in the forest, and there wasn't anything she could do to stop it. 2 weeks after their arrival at the cabin, Boone announced that he thought it was safe enough for him to ride down the mountain and get news from Sakura. He'd approach from a different direction, talk to some folks he trusted, see if the search for Zelda had died down or if Clayton Thornhill was still determined to find her. "Will you be all right here alone for a day?" he asked. "I'll be fine," Zelda assured him, though the thought of being without him made her anxious. "I can manage the chores. There's a rifle by the door, loaded and ready. You know how to shoot, a little. My father taught me when I was younger, though I haven't held a gun in years." Boone spent an hour that morning refreshing her memory, showing her how to load and aim and fire the rifle at targets he set up in the clearing. She was clumsy at first, but it came back to her gradually. By the time he was ready to leave, she could at least hit a tree trunk at 20 paces. "That'll do," Boone said, though he looked troubled. "You shouldn't need it. No one knows about this place, but just in case, you'll have protection." He rode out shortly after, and suddenly the cabin felt enormous and empty. Zelda busied herself with chores, baking bread in the cast iron stove, washing clothes in the stream, mending a tear in one of Boone's shirts that she'd noticed. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness, and every sound from the forest made her jump and reach for the rifle. By the time dusk fell and Boone still hadn't returned, Zelda was fighting down panic. What if something had happened to him? What if Clayton's men had caught him and forced him to reveal her location? What if he'd been hurt or killed, and she was stranded up here in the mountains with no way to survive on her own? She was standing in the cabin doorway, staring down the darkening trail, when she finally heard hoofbeats. Boone emerged from the tree line astride his gray horse, and relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees went weak. He dismounted and led the horse to the stable, then came to the cabin where Zelda was waiting. In the lamplight, she could see his expression was grim. "What did you learn?" she asked. Boone came inside and closed the door firmly behind him. "Clayton Thornhill has put a bounty on information leading to your return. $500, which is enough money to tempt a lot of desperate men. Your father's declared you kidnapped and is saying I'm a criminal who stole you away by force." Zelda felt her blood run cold. $500, that's a fortune. "It is, and it means we can't risk moving you for a while yet. The trails will have men watching them, hoping to cash in on that bounty. You're safer here, hidden, until either the reward gets pulled or enough time passes that people stop looking so hard. How long will that be? I don't know. Months, maybe. I'm sorry, Zelda. I know this isn't what you planned. It's not your fault." Zelda moved to start preparing supper, needing something to do with her hands. "At least I'm safe here. That's more than I had 2 weeks ago." They ate in troubled silence, both thinking about the implications of being trapped in the cabin together for an extended period. After supper, Boone went outside to smoke his pipe and stare at the stars while Zelda cleaned up. When he came back inside, his expression had softened slightly. "We'll make it work," he said. "I'll teach you more about surviving up here, about hunting and trapping and reading the weather. Skills you can use wherever you end up eventually. Time won't be wasted." So began a new phase of Zelda's life in the mountains. Boone proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to set snares for rabbits, how to read animal tracks, how to identify edible plants and which ones to avoid. He taught her to shoot with real accuracy, to skin and prepare game, to tan hides and cure meat. She learned which trees made the best firewood, and how to predict incoming storms by watching the sky and the behavior of animals. In return, Zelda brought order and comfort to Boone's rough bachelor existence. She cooked meals that were more than just fuel, using wild herbs and careful seasoning to make even simple ingredients taste special. She kept the cabin cleaner and more organized than it had ever been. She mended his clothes with neat, careful stitches, and even managed to trade some of her skills for fabric from a traveling peddler who passed through the valley, sewing new shirts for Boone that actually fit his large frame properly. They fell into an easy partnership, working together on the daily tasks of mountain living. And slowly, carefully, they began to open up to each other in ways that went beyond practical cooperation. One evening in early July, as they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of crimson and gold, Boone told her about the war, really told her, describing the battles he'd fought and the friends he'd lost, and the way it had changed him from a boy with simple ideas about right and wrong into a man who understood that the world was far more complicated and cruel than he'd imagined. "I killed men," he said quietly. "Young men, probably not much different from me, fighting for their own side and their own beliefs. I did it because it was war and that's what soldiers do, but I think about them sometimes. Wonder if they had families waiting for them, people who mourned when they didn't come home. Wonder if the world is actually any better for all that death and suffering." "You survived," Zelda said. "You built a good life here, a peaceful one. Maybe that counts for something. Maybe." Boone looked at her, and in his eyes she saw old pain that had never quite healed. "I came up to these mountains because I needed silence. Needed space to stop hearing the cannons and the screaming. It helped, being alone. But lately I've been thinking that maybe too much silence isn't good either. Maybe people need other people, even broken ones." Zelda's heart ached for him. Without thinking, she reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his much larger ones. He looked down at their joined hands in surprise, then back at her face. "You're not broken," she said firmly. "You're kind and good and strong. The fact that the war hurt you just means you're human." Boone didn't pull his hand away. They sat like that as the light faded and stars began to emerge, holding hands like it was the most natural thing in the world. After that night, something shifted between them. They touched more casually now, Boone's hand on her back as he guided her through the forest, Zelda's fingers brushing his as she handed him tools or food. They sat closer together during evening reading time. They lingered over conversations that stretched late into the night, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories and dreams and fears. Zelda knew she was completely in love with him. She'd been falling for weeks now, but sitting under the stars holding his hand had pushed her over some invisible edge into territory she'd never expected to reach. She loved his quiet strength, his gentle humor, the way he treated every living thing with respect and care. She loved how safe she felt with him, how he never raised his voice or his hand, how he looked at her like she mattered, like she was more than just property or a burden. But Boone never spoke of love, never indicated that he saw her as anything more than someone he was protecting. He was affectionate in small ways, but always careful, always maintaining some invisible line between them. And Zelda, terrified of ruining what they had, kept her feelings locked tightly inside. August came, and with it the brief mountain summer reached its peak. The valley was lush and green, flowers blooming in wild profusion in the meadows, and the days stretched long and warm. Boone took Zelda on longer expeditions into the surrounding wilderness, teaching her to navigate by landmarks and the position of the sun. They would pack supplies and spend whole days exploring, returning to the cabin tired and dirty and happy. On one such expedition, they came across a natural hot spring hidden deep in the forest, steam rising from clear water that bubbled up from some underground source. Boone had clearly been there before because he led her straight to it without hesitation. "This is one of my favorite spots," he said. "The water's hot year-round. In winter, when the snow is 6 feet deep, you can still come here and soak away the cold." Zelda stared at the pool, which was surrounded by smooth rocks and fed by the spring that kept the water constantly fresh and clean. "It's beautiful. You can bathe here if you want. I'll go back down the trail a ways, give you privacy." He disappeared into the trees, and Zelda didn't waste time. She'd been bathing in the cold stream near the cabin, shivering through quick, necessary washing. The thought of soaking in hot water was too tempting to resist. She stripped off her clothes and stepped into the pool, gasping at the heat, but then sighing with pleasure as she sank down to her neck. She soaked for a long time, washing her hair with the soft soap she'd made from lye and rendered fat, scrubbing away weeks of accumulated grime. When she finally emerged, clean and pink from the heat, she felt like a new person. She dressed in clean clothes she'd brought in her pack and called for Boone. He returned looking carefully at everything except her. "Feel better. Wonderful. Thank you for showing me this place." They made their way back to the cabin as afternoon faded toward evening. And that night, Zelda couldn't stop thinking about the hot spring, about how Boone had known she'd love it and had shared one of his special places with her. Every small gesture he made felt weighted with meaning, and she found herself studying his face in the firelight, wondering what he was thinking, wondering if he felt even a fraction of what she felt. The answer came unexpectedly, a week later. Zelda had been up early, making bread and humming to herself as she worked the dough when Boone came in from his morning chores. He stopped in the doorway and just watched her for a moment, and when she looked up questioningly, the expression on his face made her breath catch. "What?" she asked. "You look happy," he said quietly. "You're humming and smiling and you look happy. I just realized I've never seen you look that way before. The first time I met you in that alley in Sakura, You looked terrified. And for weeks after we came here, you looked hunted, like you were always waiting for something bad to happen. But right now, you look happy." Zelda set down the bread dough and wiped her hands on her apron. "I am happy. Happier than I've ever been, actually. Is that strange?" "No," Boone said, moving into the cabin and closing the door. "No, it's not strange. I just didn't expect it. Didn't expect that you'd find anything worth being happy about up here in the middle of nowhere with just me for company." "Just you." Zelda felt her heart hammering. "Boone, you're the reason I'm happy. You saved me from Clayton Thornhill. You brought me here and taught me how to survive and treated me with more kindness than I've ever known. How could I not be happy?" Boone crossed the space between them in 3 long strides. He stopped just in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Those blue eyes that she'd fallen so completely in love with. "Zelda, I need to tell you something, and I don't know if I should because it might complicate everything, but I can't keep it to myself anymore." He took a deep breath. "I'm in love with you. I've been falling in love with you since the day you asked me for help in that alley. This desperate, brave girl willing to risk everything for freedom. And every day since then, I've fallen harder. Watching you adapt to mountain life. Watching you learn and grow and start to heal from what your father and that bastard Thornhill did to you. I love you, and I don't know what to do about it because I know I promised to take you to a new town and a new life, and I'll keep that promise if it's what you want. But if there's any chance you might feel the same way, if there's any chance you might want to stay here with me, I need you to know that I'd spend the rest of my life making you happy if you'd let me." Zelda felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they were happy tears. "You love me." "I love you," Boone confirmed. "So much it scares me sometimes." She reached up and cupped his bearded face in her flowery hands. "I love you too. I've loved you for weeks, maybe months. I was afraid to say anything because I thought you just saw me as someone you were helping, a duty or an obligation." "Never an obligation," Boone said fiercely. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Zelda Zimmerman." Then he was kissing her, gentle at first and then deeper as she responded, her arms going around his neck and his hands sliding to her waist, pulling her close. He tasted like coffee and pine and everything good and right in the world. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zelda was laughing and crying at the same time. "Does this mean you'll stay?" Boone asked, his forehead resting against hers. "Will you marry me and make this your home, make me the luckiest man in the territory?" "Yes," Zelda said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it. I can't imagine being anywhere else or with anyone else. This is my home now. You're my home." Boone picked her up and spun her around, and her laughter filled the cabin with a joy that had been missing from both their lives for far too long. When he set her down, he kissed her again, and this time it was a promise, a commitment, the sealing of a bond that would last the rest of their lives. They were married a month later by a traveling preacher who made circuits through the remote mountain settlements. Boone had ridden to fetch him, bringing back the preacher and his wife to serve as witnesses to the simple ceremony held in the clearing beside the cabin. Zelda wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Boone had bought on his trip down the mountain, pale blue that matched the summer sky. Boone wore his best shirt and had trimmed his beard, looking impossibly handsome and slightly nervous as they stood before the preacher. "Do you, Boone Everett, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked. "I do," Boone said, his eyes locked on Zelda's face. "And do you, Zelda Zimmerman, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Zelda said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride." Boone kissed her tenderly while the preacher's wife applauded. When they broke apart, both grinning foolishly, Zelda felt like her heart might burst from happiness. She was married to the man she loved, free from the life she'd escaped, standing in the wilderness that had become her sanctuary. The preacher and his wife stayed for a wedding supper, and then departed the next morning with Boone's thanks and payment for their services. Alone again, Boone and Zelda settled into married life with the same easy partnership they'd developed over the months of living together, now deepened and enriched by openly expressed love. The sleeping arrangements changed, of course. That first night as man and wife, Boone carried Zelda to the bed they would now share, laying her down gently and then stretching out beside her. They made love for the first time with the tenderness of people who'd waited and wanted, and were finally free to express everything they felt. Boone was careful with her, aware of her inexperience and the trauma she carried from her past, and Zelda discovered that physical love with someone you truly loved was nothing like the violent degradation she'd expected from Clayton Thornhill. It was beautiful and intimate and right. Afterward, lying wrapped in Boone's arms with her head on his broad chest, listening to his heartbeat slow back to normal, Zelda felt peace settle over her like a benediction. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too, Mrs. Everett," Boone replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Mrs. Everett," Zelda repeated, testing out the name. "I like how that sounds. Good, because you're stuck with it now." They fell asleep tangled together, and when Zelda woke in the gray light of dawn, she looked at Boone's sleeping face and marveled at how much her life had changed. 6 months ago, she'd been trapped in Sakura, promised to a monster, with no hope of escape. Now she was married to a good man in a home she loved, with a future stretching ahead full of possibility. The seasons turned as they always did in the mountains. September brought the first cold nights, and the aspens turning gold among the evergreens. October painted the valley in shades of crimson and orange. Boone taught Zelda how to preserve meat for winter, how to store root vegetables in the cold cellar he'd dug beneath the cabin floor, how to prepare for the long months when snow would lock them in the valley. In November, the first major snow fell, blanketing everything in white silence. Zelda had never experienced a mountain winter, and at first the isolation was frightening. But Boone had prepared well, and the cabin stayed warm and cozy even as the snow piled higher outside. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading together or just talking, learning new depths to each other now that they had unlimited time and privacy. "Tell me about your mother," Boone said one night as wind howled outside and snow hissed against the windows. Zelda smiled, remembering. "She was gentle. I think that's the word that describes her best. She had a quiet voice and soft hands, and she never raised her voice even when my father did. She used to sing while she worked, old songs from her childhood in Missouri, and she loved flowers. We had a little garden behind the house where she grew roses and honeysuckle, and she'd spend hours tending them." "You're like her," Boone said. "You have that same gentleness, that same strength that doesn't need to shout or force to get things done." "I hope so. I hope I'm like her and not like him." "You're nothing like your father," Boone said firmly. "You're kind and brave and good. Don't doubt that." Winter deepened, and sometime in January, Zelda began to suspect she might be pregnant. Her monthly courses had stopped, and she was tired all the time, needing afternoon naps that were unusual for her. She said nothing at first, wanting to be sure, but as the signs became more obvious, she finally told Boone one evening as they prepared for bed. "I think I'm carrying a child," she said quietly. Boone went very still. Then a smile spread across his face, huge and delighted. "A baby? We're going to have a baby, I think so. I'm not certain yet, but all the signs point to it." Boone picked her up and held her carefully like she was made of glass. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "Zelda, you've made me the happiest man alive. You're not worried about bringing a child into the world up here so far from doctors and towns." "I'm terrified," Boone admitted. "But I'm also happier than I can say. We'll manage. Women have been having babies in remote places since the beginning of time. We'll do what we need to do." He spent the rest of the winter being absurdly protective, barely letting Zelda lift anything heavier than a cup of coffee, insisting she rest and eat well and take care of herself. She found his overprotectiveness both endearing and occasionally irritating, but she understood the fear behind it. They were alone up here, and if something went wrong during the birth, there would be no help readily available. As spring began to melt the snow and green shoots pushed up through the soggy ground, Boone made the difficult decision to bring someone up to the cabin to help with the birth. He rode down the mountain and returned a week later with a weathered woman named Anna Crawford, who'd served as a midwife for settlements throughout the territory for 30 years. "Boone tells me you're due sometime in late summer," Anna said after examining Zelda. "Everything looks good and healthy. You're strong and this baby is growing well. I'll stay here through the birth and a few weeks after, make sure both of you come through it safely." Having Anna at the cabin changed the dynamic somewhat. She was a no-nonsense woman with a sharp tongue and a good heart, and she kept Zelda and Boone both in line with stern admonishments about proper nutrition and exercise and preparation for the birth. But she was also kind, and Zelda found herself grateful for another woman's company after so many months alone with just Boone. In August, on a hot afternoon when thunder rumbled over the peaks, Zelda went into labor. The birth was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning, but Anna guided her through it with firm competence, and Boone stayed by her side the whole time, letting her crush his hand during contractions and murmuring encouragement even when Zelda was sure she couldn't endure another minute. Finally, as dawn light filled the cabin, their son was born. Anna placed the squalling, red-faced infant on Zelda's chest, and Zelda looked down at him through tears of exhaustion and joy. "A boy," Boone said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have a son, Zelda. What should we name him?" Zelda asked, touching the baby's tiny fingers in wonder. "Thomas," Boone said without hesitation. "After my father, Thomas Everett." "Thomas," Zelda repeated. "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to your family." The baby quieted at the sound of her voice, and when his eyes opened briefly, they were the same striking blue as his father's. Boone reached out with one huge, calloused finger and gently stroked his son's cheek, and the look on his face was something Zelda would remember for the rest of her life. Anna stayed for 3 more weeks, teaching Zelda how to nurse and care for the infant, making sure both mother and baby were recovering well. By the time she left to return to her own life down the mountain, Zelda felt confident in her new role as a mother, and little Thomas was thriving. Life settled into a new rhythm, dictated now by the needs of a small baby. Zelda spent much of her time nursing and tending to Thomas, while Boone took over more of the household chores, all while continuing to hunt and trap and maintain their home. But neither of them minded the exhaustion and chaos that came with a newborn. They had built something precious here in their mountain valley, a family forged from escape and survival and love. The years passed with surprising speed. Thomas grew from infant to toddler to a sturdy little boy who was fearless in exploring the forest around their cabin, always under his father's watchful eye. When Thomas was 3, Zelda gave birth to a daughter they named Charlotte, and 2 years after that, another son arrived whom they called James. The cabin that had once seemed spacious for 2 people was now filled with the noise and chaos and love of a growing family. Boone proved to be a wonderful father, patient and playful with his children, while also teaching them the skills they'd need to survive mountain life. He showed Thomas how to track deer and set snares, taught Charlotte which plants were safe to eat and which to avoid, carried James on his shoulders while checking trap lines. And Zelda watched her husband with their children and fell in love with him all over again every day. They were not completely isolated from the world. Once or twice a year, Boone would make the trek down to Socorro or one of the other settlements for supplies, and occasionally other mountain men or trappers would pass through their valley and stop for a meal and conversation. Through these visitors, they learned that Clayton Thornhill had eventually given up the search for Zelda and had married another woman, who, according to reports, was already showing signs of the abuse he inflicted. Zelda felt guilt about that, knowing another woman was suffering the fate she'd escaped. But Boone reminded her that she wasn't responsible for Clayton's actions, and that she'd done the only thing she could by saving herself. They also learned that Zelda's father had drunk himself to death 2 years after she disappeared, his liver finally giving out from years of abuse. Zelda felt surprisingly little at that news, just a sort of quiet sadness for the relationship they'd never had, for the father he might have been if he'd chosen differently. But mostly, the news from the outside world felt distant and unimportant compared to the life they were building. The cabin was expanded as the children grew, Boone adding on another room for sleeping quarters so everyone had space. The garden plot grew larger each year, and Zelda became skilled at preserving vegetables and fruits for winter. They acquired chickens for eggs and a milk cow for dairy. The rough homestead became more established, more permanent, a true home in the wilderness. One evening in late autumn, when Thomas was 8 and Charlotte was 5 and James was 3, Zelda stood outside the cabin and watched the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. She could hear Boone inside reading to the children, his deep voice rising and falling as he acted out different characters, and the sound of the children's laughter floating through the open door. She thought about the girl she'd been 10 years ago, terrified and trapped, willing to die in the desert rather than marry Clayton Thornhill. That girl would have never imagined this life, this happiness, this family. She'd been so focused on escape that she hadn't dared to dream about what might come after. But Boone had given her more than escape. He'd given her a home and love, and a future beyond anything she could have imagined. And she had given him the same, taken his lonely existence and filled it with warmth and companionship and the chaos of children. They had saved each other, really, in ways neither of them had expected when she approached him in that alley in Socorro. "Mama," Charlotte called from the doorway. "Papa says it's time for bed, and we need you to sing us a song." Zelda smiled and turned toward the cabin, toward the light and warmth spilling from its windows, toward her family and her life and everything that mattered. "I'm coming, sweetheart." She went inside and joined Boone on the bed where all 3 children were piled around him, waiting for their bedtime song. She sang the old lullaby her mother had sung to her, and Boone's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close. When the song ended and the children's eyes were drooping with sleep, Boone kissed her temple gently. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you too," Zelda whispered back. "Thank you for giving me this life. Thank you for choosing to stay, for choosing us." They tucked the children into their beds and retreated to their own sleeping space. And as Zelda drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she felt nothing but gratitude for the mountain man who'd offered her escape and a kinder future, and who'd become her whole world in the process. The years continued their steady march. The children grew into adolescence and then young adulthood, each of them capable and confident in the mountain life they'd been raised to. Thomas inherited his father's size and strength, growing into a young man who was already taller than Boone by the time he turned 16. Charlotte was quieter and more studious, spending hours poring over the books in Boone's collection and teaching herself everything she could. James was the adventurous one, always pushing boundaries and exploring further than he should, giving both his parents gray hairs with his exploits. When Thomas was 18, he announced his intention to leave the valley for a while, to see more of the territory and maybe find a wife of his own. Zelda's heart ached at the thought of him leaving, but both she and Boone understood that young people needed to make their own way in the world. They sent him off with supplies and advice, and the knowledge that he'd always have a home to return to. He came back 2 years later with a bride, a cheerful girl named Sarah who adapted to mountain life with surprising ease and who fit into the family as if she'd always been there. Charlotte eventually married a man she met on one of the family's rare trips to town, a schoolteacher who was content to make his life in their mountain valley. And James, true to form, struck out on his own to become a scout for wagon trains heading west, though he visited regularly and always spoke of eventually settling down near his parents. Zelda and Boone grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies moving a bit slower than they once had. But the love between them never dimmed, never became routine or taken for granted. They still sat together in the evenings, reading or talking or simply being together in comfortable silence. They still held hands when they walked through the forest. They still kissed each other goodnight and woke up grateful to see the other's face. "You ever regret it?" Boone asked one evening when they were sitting on the porch watching their grandchildren play in the clearing. Thomas and Sarah had blessed them with 3 grandchildren, and Charlotte had added 2 more. Leaving civilization behind, spending your whole life up here in the mountains. Zelda looked at him in surprise. "Never, not once. Why would you ask that? I just wonder sometimes if you might have been happier with a normal life. A house in town, neighbors, church socials, all the things normal women have." "I'm not interested in what normal women have," Zelda said firmly. She took his hand in hers, their fingers interlacing automatically. "This is the life I chose, Boone. I chose you, and I'd choose you again every single day for the rest of my life. You gave me freedom and love and a family. You gave me respect and partnership and a home where I feel safe. How could I possibly regret any of that?" Boone raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I'm a lucky man." "We're both lucky," Zelda corrected. "We found each other when we both needed saving. That's a rare and precious thing." They sat together, as the sun set behind the peaks they'd called home for so many years, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together. And when the stars came out and the grandchildren were called inside for bed, Boone and Zelda lingered on the porch a bit longer, holding hands and grateful for every moment they'd shared. They had started with nothing but desperation and hope, a young woman fleeing a cruel fate and a mountain man willing to offer help to a stranger. From those beginnings, they'd built something beautiful and lasting, a love story set against the harsh beauty of the New Mexico mountains. It wasn't the life anyone would have predicted for either of them, but it was theirs, chosen and cherished and worth every hardship they'd endured along the way. And as they finally rose to head inside for the night, Boone pulled Zelda into his arms one more time, holding her close the way he'd held her on that first ride away from Sakura so many years ago. She was older now, grayer, her face lined with the passage of time, but to him she was still the brave girl who'd asked for his help, still the woman who'd made his lonely cabin into a home, still the love of his life. "Forever," he whispered against her hair. "Forever," Zelda agreed, and she meant it with all her heart. They walked inside together, into the warmth and light of their home, into the life they'd made against all odds, into the future they'd keep building together for as long as they had. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night, enclosing them in the world they'd created where love had triumphed over cruelty and kindness had prevailed over violence. It was a simple ending to an extraordinary story, but then the best endings often were. They had each other, they had their family, and they had the mountains that had sheltered them and made them whole. That was more than enough. That was everything.